Wei Wuxian had barely opened his eyes before a foot flew at him and slammed into his ribcage. A voice thundered in his ear. "You think you can play dead?" Whoever it was kicked him and kicked him again until he was nearly bleeding. While he was flat on his back, his head lolling on the ground, a hazy thought came to him. "They've got some nerve to kick me, the Yiling patriarch." Wei Wuxian hadn't heard the voice of a single living soul for who knew how many years. Much less a voice so loud and angry it sounded like the wail of a dying hen. Though the room swam and stars danced in front of his eyes, he could vaguely make out the voice's owner, a young man who went back to assaulting Wei Wuxian's ringing ears with his grating cries. "Why don't you think about whose house you're living in? Whose rice you're eating? Whose money you're shitting away? Who cares if I take some of your things? They're all mine anyway." Around Wei Wuxian echoed the crashes and bangs of people ransacking every corner and hidey hole of wherever he was. Some moments later, his sight slowly began to clear. There was a shadowy grey roof floating above him, and angry brows atop a green-tinged face, from which furious spittle flew. "You want to report me?" the face shouted. "You think I'm scared? You think there's a single person in this household who'll have your back?" Two burly men, probably servants, stepped around Wei Wuxian. "Master, we've smashed everything," they said. "Already?" the young man asked. "This lousy room barely had anything in it in the first place," one of them replied. The squawking youth was mostly satisfied with this, so he turned and nearly jabbed his finger into Wei Wuxian's nostril. He said, "Report me if you have the spine. Who are you playing dead for? As if anyone gives a fuck about your scrap metal and bits of paper. I'll smash it all. Let's see what you can drag out to report me with then. You think you're hot shit because you spent a few years in a cultivation sect? You're more like a mangy cur who's been chased away with its tail between its legs." Fatigue cast a pall over Wei Wuxian's thoughts. He had been dead for so many years, he truly hadn't been faking it. Who was this, he thought? Where was he? Since when had he ever done any body snatching? The dying hen had kicked him and wrecked his room, showering Wei Wuxian with his fury, and now he had taken his servants and swaggered outside. He shouted an order as he slammed the door. "Keep your eyes pinned on him. Don't let him get out and humiliate us." The pair accepted the command in unison. Wei Wuxian waited for all the noise to die down and then tried to rise, but his body refused to obey him, forcing him back down. His only option was to roll onto his stomach and look around the animal den that this person named Mo lived in, all while his head was still spinning and his vision was still a blurry mess. On one side of him, a bronze mirror had been tossed to the ground. Wei Wuxian reached out his hand and dragged it over. A strange and snow-white face appeared in the mirror, cheeks unevenly smeared with red. If he had only stuck out a long crimson tongue, he'd have looked like a still-living, hanged ghost. Not quite able to accept his appearance, he flung the mirror away and rubbed at his face, accidentally crusting his hands with the white powder. Fortunately, it seemed the body he now occupied hadn't been born with this grotesque appearance, and he could blame the products its previous owner piled atop his skin instead. Not only had this fully grown man painted his whole face with rouge, he'd done it in this absurdly hideous manner. After recovering from the shock, Wei Wuxian found he had recovered a little of his strength and could finally sit up. Only then did he notice the crimson circle drawn beneath him. It was a magic circle, hand-drawn, seemingly with blood, still damp and giving off a coppery stench. In the middle, a wild, shaking finger had scrawled a spell. Although Wei Wuxian had unknowingly smudged the runes, the ghastly energy surrounding it was unmistakable. For better or for worse, people had treated him as the world's supreme evil for many years now, giving him titles like the Grandmaster of demonic cultivation. Of course he knew these types of nasty things like the back of his hand. He hadn't stolen someone else's body. Someone had sacrificed theirs to him. The body sacrificing spell was essentially a kind of curse. The casters slashed their own skin with a deadly weapon, used their own blood to sketch the circle and paint the runes, and then sat in the center, offering their body to an evil spirit. Paying the earth the price of their soul, they summoned a being of irredeemable wickedness, and then begged the spirit to take over their flesh and make their dreams a reality. The exact opposite of body snatching. Both were notorious and forbidden, but the former had not been met with the same enthusiastic reception as the latter. After all, it was rare that anyone longed for anything so much that they were willing to give up everything for it. Thus, people who had done it were few and far between. In the past century, even the stories had dried out. According to the ancient records, there had only been 3 or 4 confirmed cases in the past 100,000 years. Each of these 3 or 4 people's wishes had been the same: revenge. The vicious ghosts they had summoned realized those dreams with cruel and bloody perfection. Wei Wuxian's heart was uneasy. How was he, a being of irredeemable wickedness? Sure, his reputation wasn't great, and the circumstances of his death were tragic and miserable. But first of all, he hadn't turned into an evil spirit, and second, he hadn't sought revenge. You could search all of the earth and heaven without finding a single more peaceful, better-natured ghost. Promise. But the trouble was, bodily sacrifice followed the wishes of the caster. It didn't matter how uneasy Wei Wuxian was. He had already taken over the prophet body, and therefore tacitly consented to the contract. He had to fulfill the caster's wishes, or else the curse would backfire and annihilate his soul, damning him to eternal oblivion. Wei Wuxian undid the sash of his robes and scrutinized his arm. Indeed, both of his wrists were streaked with angry, bloody gashes, scowling and glowering at him like ragged mouths. Though they had already scabbed over, he had no doubt that these weren't ordinary cuts. They would never heal if he didn't fulfill the wishes of his body's original owner. Moreover, the longer he waited, the worse they would become, and if he pushed back the task past due, both his body and his soul would be shredded alive. After repeatedly confirming that he made no mistake, Wei Wuxian mentally cursed the absurdity of the situation and, clinging to the wall, finally forced himself to his feet. Though the room he found himself in was indeed large, it was sparse and squalid. The cotton blanket covering the bed hadn't been washed or changed in who knew how many weeks, and stunk of mildew. Someone had kicked over the bamboo trash bin lying in the corner, spilling the waste and scrap paper inside all over the dusty floor. Wei Wuxian noticed that some of the paper seemed to be covered in ink marks, so he picked one up, examined it, and indeed found words crammed into every corner of the page. He busied himself with collecting all the scraps he could find. On these sheets, his body's first owner must have vented his misery and dejection. Some of what he had written could only be described as the incoherent cries of a man whose torment so twisted his words that it seeped out of the paper and assaulted the senses. As Wei Wuxian patiently read page by page, he began to feel more and more unsettled. Though his attempts at organizing what he read felt akin to groping through the darkness, he was able to clear up a few basic facts. First, his body's original owner was named Mo Shanyu, and this area was called Mo Manor. Mo Shanyu's grandfather had been the local area's big landlord, but he had few kinsmen and no sons. Although he worked diligently for many years to produce male progeny, his efforts had resulted only in 2 daughters. The second daughter's name need not be mentioned, as it was the first who became the house's mistress. Her husband moved in with the Mo family after they were married. Though the second daughter was remarkably beautiful, her birth mother was a household servant, and thus the family put little thought into marrying her off. Anyone would have been fine. Who knew that when she was 16, she would randomly meet a passing leader of some great clan and catch his eye? The two turned Mo Manor into their private love nest. A year later, their second Mo daughter gave birth to Mo Shanyu. Originally, the Mo household had held her and the entire affair in general in great contempt. But in the eyes of the ordinary people, the fact that such a grand cultivator had found his way to the Mo family's doorstep and into their home meant that the Moors must have been blessed by heaven. Nobly and somewhat unusually, that chief even supported and assisted the Mo family, even though they were not his own. The winds of opinion in the household thus took a sharp turn. Not only had the family prospered through the connection, those around them also envied them to the highest degree. But not long after, that cultivator's unbounded desire longed for fresher meat. Gradually, his visits dwindled. He had eaten at the Mo Manor for less than 2 years before growing bored. Once Mo Shanyu was 4, the Mo family saw him no more. Within the next few years, the winds of opinion in the Mo Manor changed once again. The contempt and ridicule returned, this time accompanied by sneering pity. However, the second Mo daughter was by no means resigned to her fate. Her belief that her great chief would not forget his own child was unshakable. Sure enough, when Mo Shanyu turned 14, that clan chief ordered a band of men to solemnly retrieve him. The second Mo daughter could hold her head high again. Though she could not accompany her son, she could sweep away her previous misery and replace it with pride and elation. Haughtily, she announced to everyone that her son would rise like a bird and become a renowned cultivator, bringing honor to all of his forefathers. Consequently, opinion at Mo Manor changed for a 3rd time. However, before Mo Shanyu's cultivation training had borne results, and before he had inherited his father's family treasures, he was chased out. His expulsion, moreover, was not some tidy, quiet affair, but an unseemly, unsightly ordeal. Not only was Mo Shanyu gay, but he had also had the audacity to harass his fellow disciples. Thus, the ugly matter had been publicly exposed. On top of all that, he was at best an average talent, with no notable achievements. He had no excuse to remain. Battered by the blizzard, only to be bitten by frost, Mo Shanyu did not suffer only this one disaster. After returning home, he became entirely, completely insane. Some days were better, and some were worse. But one way or another, his brains seemed to have been scared right out of his ears. Where Wushan's brow wrinkled. If Mo Shanyu were only gay, then that would have been one thing. But he was also a lunatic. No wonder his face was caked in so much powder that it looked like he'd been hanged. No wonder no one had batted an eye at the giant magic array on the ground, still wet with fresh blood. If he had painted the entire room with blood, from the floor to the walls to the roof over his head, it wouldn't have startled anyone who happened to see it. Everybody knew that there was something wrong with his head. Once Mo Shanyu had returned home The sneers, the mockery, and the ridicule grew so thick and circulated so widely that they seemed to blanket the earth and cover the skies. But this time there was no more hope for a change in fortune. The second Mo daughter was unable to bear this kind of blow. She held so much hatred inside her lungs, and now there was no hope of letting it go. It suffocated her, and soon she was dead. By this time, Mo Shanyu's grandfather was also dead, so the elder Mo daughter now reigned over Mo Manor. This Lady Mo had been unable to bear the sight of her sister since they were young. At her sister's bastard, she could only levy thousands of scornful glares. She had a single son, Mo Yuan, the youth who had ransacked the room. When Mo Shanyu had been whisked away to his father's, the elder Mo daughter thought that she could also exploit the family connection. She hoped that the cultivators who had fetched her nephew would also happen to pick up her son and turn him into a cultivator as well. Of course, she was refused, or rather, ignored. She had wasted her breath. It wasn't as though she were haggling over cabbages. Buy one son and get one free. It was a mystery where this family had gotten their self-confidence. They all had a bizarre, unshakable belief that Mo Yuan possessed the blood and the talent to earn himself the respect and recognition of these cultivators, had he been the one taken. He could never have ended up like his cousin and failed to make a decent showing. Mo Yuan was little when his cousin had been taken away, but unendingly deluged with utter nonsense, his faith in his own abilities was unwavering. Every day, for quite some time, he humiliated Mo Shanyu, hollering that his cousin had robbed him of his chance. The possessions that Mo Shanyu had brought home, the talismans, the medicines, the little cultivator's tools, he coveted so much that his hands itched, and he treated them as though they were entirely his own. If he wanted to take them, he'd take them. If he wanted to break them, he'd break them. Although Mo Shanyu suffered frequent bouts of insanity, he still knew that he was being abused. He tried to endure it, but his cousin only got worse. Eventually, his entire room was practically cleaned out by his envious cousin, and his endurance finally wore out. He went to his aunt and uncle and forced himself to stutter out a complaint. Thus, his cousin had shown up at his door today and caused a ruckus. The paper's densely packed words made Wei Wuxian's eyes hurt, and by then he had no doubts about what kind of shitty, wretched life Mo Shanyu had lived. No wonder he had no qualms about sacrificing his body to an evil spirit for the sake of revenge. Once Wei Wuxian's eyes stopped aching, his head started aching instead. In principle, as the evil spirit that Mo Shanyu had summoned, he should have been able to hear the exact wishes that the miserable man had buried in his heart. But this forbidden technique that Mo Shanyu had secretly stolen from somewhere might have had incomplete instructions. He might have skipped a step. Wei Wuxian could easily guess that he wanted some sort of revenge on the Mo family. But exactly what kind of revenge? How severe? Did he only want his things back? Did he want them beaten? Or exterminated? Most likely, he wanted them all exterminated. After all, Mo Shanyu had done his time in the world of cultivation, and thus should have been aware of how Wei Wuxian was often described as ungrateful and deranged. Was there anyone Mo Shanyu could have chosen more likely to be called a vicious fiend? If he had the nerve to pick Wei Wuxian, then he could not possibly have a dream so tame and mild. Thus, Wei Wuxian had no choice but to sigh. You found the wrong guy.